Last time we talked about the impact that Theodore Roosevelt has on progressivism in the United States. But he decides to call it quits in 1908. And it's kind of interesting because Roosevelt is 42 when he's, well, I shouldn't say elected president, but when he becomes president, which means that he ends his presidential career at the age of 50. Now, I know that's probably ancient for most of you, but for many politicians, that's the age in which they first consider running for national office, let alone ending their political career. So this is kind of extraordinary in its own way. But Roosevelt kind of contents himself with the idea that his progressive policies, especially his legacy, the idea of conservation, will be protected and defended by his loyal deputy. And of course, this deputy um, is otherwise known as my favorite president, and yours too, William Howard Taft. And yes, go ahead and get this out of your system. He is the guy who gets stuck in the bathtub, which unfortunately is the only thing he's really known for. Um, William Howard Taft is actually personally selected by Roosevelt to be his successor. And by the way, that very idea is kind of weird. Most presidents don't get to do that, especially those in the Gilded Age. But if you remember, Andrew Jackson gets to do that with Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was kind of his loyal deputy. And the reason that Jackson gets to do that is because of his enormous political popularity. So Roosevelt is so popular that the Republican Party kind of goes, well, whatever Theodore Roosevelt wants, Theodore Roosevelt gets. And what he wants is his BFF, Taft, to be president. And by the way, that stamp of approval is really the only reason why Taft is able to become president, which is kind of funny because I sometimes wonder, when I'm when I go to bed and I lie in bed and think about important things, the most important thing that I wonder, of course, is did William Howard Taft actually vote for himself in the election of 1908? Because I can tell you, the guy really did not want to be president. Uh, in other words, he was almost conscripted or voluntold by Theodore Roosevelt that he was going to be his successor, and he just kind of goes with it, actually. Now, um, as it happens, um, Taft is challenged by William Jennings Bryan again. This is actually William Jennings Bryan's third time running for the presidency. And like Henry Clay, he loses a third time. And at this point, by the way, Bryan will abandon his presidential aspirations, but he'll still be a significant figure in progressive, well, actually populist circles, especially in the West. But anyway, Taft becomes president in 1908. And what you see from Taft is a much more moderate Republican. And what Roosevelt gets is a certain degree of buyer's remorse almost with Taft. And part of this is just because Roosevelt can't stand being out of power, out of the White House. And the thing is that just fundamentally, Taft is Taft is a sidekick. Taft is Robin to Roosevelt's Batman. And in Robin, whatever his accomplishments, whatever his talents, the fact is that Robin really can't have his own series. I know I hear some of you say, well, what about Teen Titans? Well, that's an ensemble cast. There's no The Robin Show. I haven't really heard of that. I mean, even to the extent that Robin is his own character, he had to become Nightwing to really become that. I mean, I think that's kind of important. Like the stamp of being a sidekick is so powerful that it's almost like I don't know, a terminal illness that you just can't get rid of. So the problem that Taft has is that ultimately he just doesn't have the dynamism, the flair that Roosevelt has. And of course, Americans have come to expect that out of their presidents. Taft is more of a throwback to the Gilded Age to a certain extent. Also, Taft is that person who wants to do a good, efficient job and do so undramatically. He's going to work his 9 to 5 and not make a whole lot of fuss about it, not call a lot of attention to himself. The problem is that you go from Taft to Roosevelt. Roosevelt was somebody who was kind of I don't want to say drama queen, because is drama queen, does that mean the same thing? I don't know. But anyway, Roosevelt just had a flair for the dramatic. His daughter Alice said that my father had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. I mean, he had a pretty high opinion of himself. He wanted to be the center of attention. Taft really didn't. And so when Roosevelt decided to bust a trust or pass a law, Roosevelt is that kid who runs around with a good essay that he wrote in school and shows it to everybody, saying, "Ooh, looky what I did." Taft is that person who gets all A's, but you never know it because he doesn't really talk about it. So the thing is that Roosevelt views himself as a progressive, somebody who's going to challenge businesses, challenge corporations. What is sometimes hard for people to understand is that if you look at it, Taft actually busts twice as many trusts as Theodore Roosevelt. In some respects, if you look at what Taft actually does, he's much more progressive. But that's besides the point, because it looks like Taft isn't really doing much. He just doesn't have the same energy or dynamism. Roosevelt takes himself very seriously. Taft, despite the fact that he gets stuck in the bathtub, he kind of owns it, actually. He doesn't take himself seriously at all. He was very fond of beginning conversations like this. So on the way here, while I was sitting on the bus, I gave up my seat to 2 women. In other words, he was very self-critical. He didn't really take himself very seriously. Anyway. Oh, and by the way, Taft only breaks up monopolies like U.S. Steel, and in his presidency, you also have the elimination of Standard Oil. The Mann-Elkins Act, by the way, passed in 1910, allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission to limit railroad companies on how many rate hikes they could actually do. The only thing that really significantly differentiates Taft from Roosevelt is that Taft was much more suspicious of imperialism and an assertive foreign policy than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the guy who said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Taft was the person who just said, well, if you throw money at people, they're not going to really attack you anyway, and there's no reason to carry a big stick. And this is the policy called dollar diplomacy, where Taft uses the superior wealth of the United States to guarantee that Latin American nations would never become deeply indebted to European empires, the way Venezuela was in the early 20th century. But anyway, when Taft is actually elected, Roosevelt decides that, there's really nothing left for him to do in politics. So he decides to go to Africa on, air quotes, a scientific expedition, which basically meant that he got the opportunity to go game hunting and shooting thousands of wild animals. What's really interesting, though, is when word gets out that Roosevelt was going on an African safari, J.P. Morgan, no fan of Roosevelt, said that America expects every lion to do its duty. You could kind of get the sense that maybe he's still a little salty about breaking up the Northern Securities Trust. But what happens is that Soon there's a conflict that develops between the conservative wing of the Republican Party and the progressive wing of the Republican Party. Remember that the progressives themselves are not really a coherent political party. It's kind of like a loose ideological grouping. So you have progressive Republicans, and then you have conservative Republicans who are more like pro-business Gilded Age Republicans. Taft passes a few tariffs that fracture the Republican Party, most notably the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Also, Taft fires Roosevelt's conservation czar, so to speak, Gifford Pinchot. And when Roosevelt hears about this, by the way, in his mind, Taft isn't just firing an employee because that employee was insubordinate, which apparently was the case. Apparently, Gifford Pinchot could be a little pig-headed. In Roosevelt's mind, Taft is not going after the employee, he's going after the policy. In other words, Taft has gone from being Roosevelt's sidekick to the person who's going after his legacy, his political baby. And so at this point, Roosevelt now becomes one of Taft's harshest critics. Nothing that Taft can do is going to be right. And part of this stems from the fact that Roosevelt is worried about his political legacy. Part of it is just the fact the guy's bored. I mean, what do you do after becoming one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history and you retire at the age of 50? I mean, my dad's in his 60s, and I can't imagine what he would do if he would retire now. I mean, that's a lot of life left to live with nothing to do. So what happens is, of course, Roosevelt decides to get back into politics because he swore off running in 1908. He didn't say anything about 1912. And so Roosevelt decides to throw his hat back in the ring and challenge his former best friend and sidekick for the Republican Party's nomination. And this takes us to the election of 1912, aka how a bull moose plus an elephant equals a donkey. I love the chimerical alchemy involved. But anyway, so the thing is that this is not going to be an election like, let's say, the election of 1884 or 1892, where basically the candidates start going after each other and criticizing each other for being corrupt or, bringing up prior paternity scandals, like in the case of Grover Cleveland. And the reason that those attacks tend to recur is because there really wasn't any other way to differentiate the candidates during the Gilded Age. Again, going back to the analogy, it's like the two parties offer either a ham sandwich or a turkey sandwich, or peanut butter and grape jelly, or peanut butter and strawberry jelly. There's just not a lot of diversity. The election of 1912 is not one of those elections. And by the way, if you are trying to pick personality over politics, I think that Americans could be forgiven for doing so in 1912. You have Theodore Roosevelt, who has more personality in his pinky than I think was present in Grover Cleveland, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and all the Gilded Age presidents combined. But not just Roosevelt. You have William Howard Taft, admittedly not as much personality, but you also have Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about in just a second, who had a lot of personality, a very different personality, but provided an ideological contrast to Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. And finally, we have Eugene V. Debs, who is running as, wait for it, a socialist. And he actually does pretty well in the election, all things considered. So you have four candidates, and Americans could be forgiven for choosing personality over politics when there's so much personality in that election. But actually, the election is governed by policy questions. And they're policy questions that we still have today. And that is the creation of welfare. If you look at societies where welfare had existed before the 20th century, they are societies that typically weren't very nice. Two societies that had insurance for unemployment or generous retirement pensions were nations like Japan and Imperial Germany. And there's a reason for that. Even though these nations were very hierarchical and not particularly progressive or liberal, the reason why these nations adopted these policies is that if you are Germany and you want to cut off part of France, that's going to mean you're going to have to go to war. So you're going to conscript your factory workers, your farmers, put them in the army, and basically yeet them. Have them charge across the border and storm French trenches. You're going to lose a lot of people. And the thing is that if you're going to war, you definitely want to keep your troops happy. So what Germany does and what Japan does, these two fairly militaristic 19th century powers, is they basically demand absolute loyalty. But they say, you know what, if you're injured or when you reach retirement age, the state will take care of you. And that's kind of weird because we think of welfare today, the idea of Social Security and that kind of thing, being a very progressive idea. But it actually was an idea that emerged with deeply militaristic roots. And so no welfare system that was permanent had ever been introduced in a modern democratic nation. The United States experiments with this in if you remember, the Freedmen's Bureau. And ultimately, that is an absolute failure. So what happens is that all of the candidates generally agree that the United States government should play some type of increased role in providing welfare for people. The only question is to what extent. If you're William Howard Taft, you're sort of a more conservative Republican, you think that things should just kind of be tweaked. If you're Theodore Roosevelt, or of course if you're Eugene V. Debs, you think that everything should be changed. Well, what happens is that when Roosevelt runs for the Republican nomination, he understands that he is kind of the underdog here because he's been out of politics. Taft is the incumbent, and Republican Party leaders tend to back Taft anyway. But remember, primaries are beginning to change. We start to see the emergence of open primaries as opposed to primaries where state political elites can kind of pick their favorites. And so what happens is that in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt wins 9 out of 12 state primaries that have the open primary system. But there are still enough states that use the older model that Taft wins a majority. So what that means is that William Howard Taft actually wins the Republican Party nomination. Well, if you're Theodore Roosevelt, no problem. You just create your own political party. Or actually, that's not quite true. Roosevelt joins the Progressive Party and is nominated as their candidate. But then his personality is so outsized that he puts his own unique brand on it and calls it, well, actually, he doesn't call this. When journalists hear that Theodore Roosevelt is joining a third party, they kind of scratch their heads because obviously they know that third parties don't really win in U.S. history. And they're like, what is a popular ex-president doing leading a third party? It's crazy. And so these journalists were like, Mr. Roosevelt, are you running on all cylinders here? And Roosevelt replies in classic Rooseveltian fashion by beating his chest and saying, I am as fit as a bull moose. And so people forget the title of the Progressive Party and start just calling it the Bull Moose Party, almost the Theodore Roosevelt Party. Now, what's different is that the Bull Moose Party is, in some respects, a very progressive party in the literal sense. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a second here. Roosevelt's platform is called New Nationalism. And among other things, he creates almost this sort of early version of Obamacare. He believes that public health care should be a right, and the government should provide that. He also talks about creating some type of social security or unemployment security. And also, we talked about how the progressives kind of like democracy. He also believes in creating primary elections, not just for major officials like presidents, but also for state and all state and federal offices. He also likes the idea of creating a federal income tax to pay for all of this, the creation of an 8-hour workday, and minimum wage laws for women. Also, what's kind of interesting, by the way, is that pretty much all of the parties, Republicans, Democrats, Socialists, they're all broadly in favor of female suffrage, at least verbally. But of course, there was a lot of rhetorical support for female suffrage before, if you remember the debate over the 15th Amendment. So that doesn't necessarily mean all too much, but there was consensus on that point. On the other hand, you have Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, at this point, is the best educated candidate who's ever run for office. And actually, still to this day, he's the best educated president in United States history because he's the only president who's ever held a doctoral degree. Wilson was an academic by profession. But what's also kind of interesting is that Wilson, unlike most of the Democratic candidates of the 19th century, is that Wilson is a Southerner. If you remember, Grover Cleveland was a New Yorker. Even James Buchanan, the president who's elected as a Democrat before the Civil War, was from Pennsylvania. Woodrow Wilson is a Southerner. And the fact that it's been over half a century since the last Southern president has been elected just shows how the stigma of the Civil War has continued. And to be honest, he's only elected because at a very early point in his life, he moves to New Jersey, gets a degree from Princeton University, and actually becomes a professor there. He also spends quite a bit of time teaching in the United Kingdom. And I think that Wilson's mother was English by birth. I could be wrong there. No, she is English. So in other words, that Wilson was Southern, but he wasn't exactly conventionally Southern. He's not somebody you would imagine acting or talking like Colonel Sanders, no matter what actor plays them on the KFC commercials. So Wilson is kind of the new face of the Democratic Party. And he also shows that not only are Republicans attracting urban progressives, but Democrats are too. He also, by the way, he's somebody whose views on the Constitution and on the United States government are kind of surprising. Wilson is somebody who believes that the United States should basically adopt a parliamentary system of government, like the British have. He's not necessarily a fan of the idea of let's say, the separation of powers. So in other words, he is, it's kind of amazing. We kind of glorify the founders today in the Constitution, but that glorification was certainly not something, it's certainly something that's kind of new to a certain extent. I'm going to pause here, but then we'll pick up with part 2 of the election of 1912.